Welcome to With Honors, the Honors College podcast at Harding University. I'm Max Sandlin, and on this podcast, as always, we're taking student questions and answers. Today, a fun and somewhat controversial one. Let's have it.
My question is, how should Christians feel about taxes? I know Jesus says, pay to Caesar what is Caesar's and pay to God what is God's. But should we be voting for more taxes to help our fellow neighbor, or should we be helping our neighbor through our church giving?
Great question. One that I remember thinking about when I was in college. And of all the professors, when I was a student at Harding, who helped me think about civic life, about the broader culture in which we live, the one who shaped me the most was Dr. Kevin Klein, who's our guest today. Dr. Klein, introduce yourself. Tell us what you do at Harding.
Well, I teach history here, and so my wife taught public administration here, so also the political side has always been part of our conversations at home, and so our standard joke was, if they're dead, I teach about them. If you wish they were dead, she teaches about them. So,
well, great legacy of teaching. You've been here for many, many years. Mrs. Klein taught for many years. When I was a student, I would go to the Klein's home for Wednesday night Bible study, small group, and so I
majored. Our home? I thought it was your home once you showed up.
Well, no, that's some truth in that. But it was great, and so I remember having some of these conversations, thinking about big picture political things, and not exactly a partisan question, but a policy question. So when you hear Amelia's question here, how should Christians feel about taxes? What's your gut instinct, your first kind of response?
Well, there's basically the Christian dispensation can only solve one of our problems, which is death. It can't solve the other problem with its taxation, right? Those proverbial ideas, the two things you can't stop are death and taxes. There's always going to be, it seems to be historically, if you're going to have any kind of community, there's going to need to be a community chest. And so who runs that, and how much goes into that, and what's deemed to be in the public sphere versus the private sphere, that's always up for, well, in our system, a vote. And so the question is, do we have any kind of template biblically to get a sense of what ought to be a proper balance? Well, not surprisingly, you look around the United States, there's 6,000 denominations. So there's also going to be like 6,000 arguments about what the balance ought to be, even though those folks are all looking to often the same authority.
Seems like in Scripture, earliest Scripture in the Old Testament, you don't have a sort of like give to church, pay your taxes.
It's all unified.
It's all one thing because God is the king and Moses sets up the law. But even that doesn't last very long. The period of the Judges, it's not clear how they're paying tithes and such, and there's very, very minimal infrastructure. There's not community paid for roads in Israel, and there's no standing army and all that.
And there's almost no cash income.
Yeah, that's right. It's agricultural products, commodities and such. And then you get to the monarchical period, and when Samuel is warning the people about a king, one of the things he says is he will take a tithe. He will take 10% of your grain and your servants, and he will draft your sons into his army, which we don't think of that as a tax, but it is a sort of like claim of the government upon.
It is, and it's been a big part in the United States of the argument as to what the poor pay.
Yeah.
The poor pay in blood, not treasure. They equip the army. They fight. When we've had fights over what we consider to be a fair system historically, like, for example, big kind of moment in this would be whether we would have an income tax. Right. And AG 94, we're debating an income tax and whether or not that's fair, whether that's judicious.
Because it's a graduated tax. Those at the top pay more, those at the bottom pay less or none.
It's more about not paying or paying. The threshold that they were debating at the time was, you got to make $4,000 and they'll take 2%. Well, $4,000 would be about $150,000 today. So you would qualify at $150,000. Well, think about it. The vast majority of the American public is not going to pay anything at a $150,000, right? But the argument as to why that was still fair was all biblical. Everybody framed their arguments at that period, 19th century, through biblical argument. Was it Chesterton says we're a nation with a soul of a church. And de Tocqueville had observed that about us and was kind of amazed at how we could argue Scripture as the foundation of public policy without triggering immediate religious civil war.
Yeah, and it seems like that's been kind of another tension point that's ebbed and flowed and changed over American history. That might be a good podcast to do another time, just what should we think about church and state and all. But if we're thinking Amelia's question, how should an individual Christian feel about this? She referenced Jesus saying, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Of course, in that moment, the Jews were being taxed by the Romans at a pretty exorbitant rate, pretty high rate. The Romans were well known for high taxes on especially whoever they could get it from.
Right.
So the people don't like paying it. It's a political.
Which were usually out of removed from your status. The poorer you were, the more you ended up having to contribute.
Right.
The less politically connected you were, the more you had to contribute.
You could get out of it if you had access to power and
That's
status
right.
and such. So they're upset about this. It's a foreign power that's taxing them. You talk about taxation without representation. This is taxation without any sort of real legal standing. And they're naturally upset about this, but Jesus, he's almost dismissive. They're trying to trick him in this hot button political issue of the day, and he says, give it to Caesar, but give to God the things that are God's. And it seems like on a surface level, what he means is the coin has Caesar's face, give the money to Caesar. You are the image of God, give God yourself or your soul or your life. But then you start thinking more deeply. Jesus is always operating on 2 or 3 levels, and he says, give to God what is God's. Well, isn't the money God's too? As he say in the Old Testament, the cattle on 1,000 hill are mine. Everything belongs to God. Well, wait, even Caesar is God's. And so how do we take this, proverbial or aphoristic wisdom and come out of that with a kind of practical attitude toward taxes?
Well, I don't have an answer for that, honestly. I mean, I have a particular opinion, but not an answer, right? I would say that, historically where we've gone, I can tell you some of the arguments that have been made.
Yeah.
Right. And so when it comes to those arguments, they're trying to balance I guess we would say the import of particular scriptures. Like for example, the idea, you mentioned a progressive taxation system. That if you
Tell us what progressive taxation system is for the listeners.
Basically, if you have accumulated or generating a good deal of income, you should pay a larger proportion of that.
The rich pay more, the poor pay less.
That's right.
And that's ideally what we have now, not getting into loopholes and...
Right. And I could pull up the records and show, the debates in Congress, and they're throwing, Luke 16:2 in, you should set aside in... as you have been prospered, right? And they took that verse and they said, aha, there you go. To the degree that you've been prospered, you should be putting into the community purse, right? Now, the question is that voluntary or involuntary? And that was a big debate, right, throughout tax policy all the way through. But the idea that the rich pay more, quote unquote, right, that was generally an assumption. Even people who opposed the income tax thought it was fair, thought it was biblical. They just thought maybe we can get this through some other means.
It also just seems like practical. It's sort of the question is, if we want services from the government, whether we mean by that the federal services like a national defense that keeps us from being attacked by foreign powers, an interstate highway system, a judiciary that can, try cases at the federal. If we want the sort of services that are provided by federal, state, and local level, services do cost money. Where can you get the money? You're going to have to say, well, you have to get it where the money is.
Yeah, I mean, it's the proverbial, bank robber when asked why does he rob banks, that's where the money is.
That's where the money is,
right?
Yeah.
And so what we've had to also deal with over the centuries is the shift of what we thought was the source of value. And so a lot of this also has to do with the biblical concept of trust or stewardship. You were talking about, was it Leviticus 25? It says, don't keep selling the land. The land is God's. Mm-hmm. You can't just, it isn't really yours. Well,
year of Jubilee and all that, where it redistributes back to the original families.
The same thing has to do with the parable of the talents. Look, just because you got a lot in your hands doesn't mean you're special. But if you're not doing anything with it, mm-hmm. then we have a problem. Okay, so the implication of all of that was, if you have more is expected. Sounds familiar. More is expected. But everybody's got to give. Now, the question was, is there a kind of a minimum threshold in this? Is money all the same value? How do I contribute? If I am like desperately poor and I barely got enough money to feed my family, how am I contributing to the public weal, the public health, right? Well, I mentioned this a moment ago. One way is these other duties, like
military service,
or serving on a jury, or any of those types of elements, mm-hmm. Other kinds of community in-kind service. So all of that was considered, and you're not surprised for me to throw this out. They used the widow's mite as an example. We can't just simply say that a 2-cent tax is nothing.
Yeah, it's significant for the poor.
Right. And it's not necessarily going to touch somebody who has an income that is 10,000 times that, to take a tenth of it. And a tenth was the part that they came down on, mm-hmm. usually. They looked at tenth as a floor, not a ceiling.
And then you did more than that if you had more. Talk about just for a second the different kinds of taxes that we have in the U.S. You mentioned income tax, but there's lots of other kinds too, right?
Yeah, because initially, again, it had to do with how money is made. And the general sense was most money was being produced by God, and you're just steward.
And agriculture is sort of a key piece of that, right? God gives the increase.
And it feels that way, right? In fact, the idea is that you paid almost all your taxes on land. And that was this idea that we want to penalize people just holding land without allowing it to be productive.
That goes all the way back to what John Locke and some of the big ideological foundations that come before us. They
didn't want people just sitting and speculating.
You can have too much money, especially if you're thinking in a land-based kind of thing.
It's not being used, and it's not yours to just hold or bury in a field waiting mm-hmm. for a better price. You have to put it to work because it's not yours. You are the servant. God is the owner. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons we tax land and made landholders have to pay more, and that comes down to us all the way to what's left in millage. Our millage taxes, if you stop and you look at what they're still able politically to pull off, has to do with building the kind of deep next generation crop of value, education.
Mm-hmm. Millage are taxes that we use to pay for schools.
Right, and they're based on land values.
And so we call all that kind of taxes are property taxes.
Right.
But as property, like what counts as property, has shifted over the years.
It has.
I mean,
and as we shifted economies, into manufacture and finance and the rest, money was made by other means. And historically, we've typically viewed those trading types of capitalization more, I don't know how to put this except in the way they put it, more sinister.
Yeah, like there was a bit of a look down upon the merchant, and the landowner was the ideal. But that really, especially like you're talking about the 19th century, by the 20th century, that feels like a prejudice that has largely flipped, that the farmer is the poor, looked down upon person, and the New York stockbroker is the pinnacle of society.
Right. When it comes to, if you will, what money commands, I think you're right. When it comes to what works as a political argument, I'm not sure.
Oh, no, yeah, that's right. That's right. That's fair.
I mean, we still idealize this idea of the virtuous working with your hands, producing value. And we still view, well, to use like William Jennings Bryan, kind of summing this up when the debate's really raging around the turn of the century about things like the income tax and the fact that we now had this merchant trader class that was producing and possessing the lion's share of wealth. Okay. And so the question was, are these, in his words, the idle holders of idle capital? Right.
Idle. Yeah.
Right. And are they actually doing anything? Or are they just skimming? You know, versus this broad-backed actual wealth creator group.
Today we might think about, we hear language like the 1%. Like people don't hate on the 1% if it's Bill Gates, who they think of as like inventing computers or whatever. But if it's a hedge fund manager,
right,
they feel differently. But I think that's a pretty fair sort of thing.
Yeah, that was certainly their sentiment, and they used biblical rhetoric. I mean, just to use William Jennings Bryan, I mean, famously his cross of gold speech is, you shall not press down upon labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. That was all about policy that was perceived of as benefiting the banker section,
right,
versus policy that would benefit the producer section.
So we have property taxes still today. We pay property taxes on our land, real estate, homes, but also on our cars. If you have like an expensive boat, you're going to pay property on it, that sort of thing. But then we have income tax that we pay on. If you make money, you pay taxes out of that individual income tax.
You can't really have a functional income tax until you have what's called a consumer society in which people are working for revenue as opposed to a lot of barter and trade. And I want to move my barn, so you have a social obligation to help me move it. I mean, there's a video right now that's gone around and circulated widely of all these Amish men moving a barn. That was just social obligation. And so
neighborliness and all. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it was obligation. You were expected to show up because otherwise people would not show up for you to do the same thing, right? Well, we codified that as we got into more of a cash-based, income-based, specialized economy. We went for where the money was, right? And the money wasn't in some sort of 20 minutes of your time, but 20 minutes of your pay.
Yeah, the cash. So we have property tax, we have income tax, and then we also have things like capital gains tax, which is the highest tax rate still. You're still paying a higher percentage of your income or your money on capital gains. That is when you're speculating in stocks, that sort of thing. So we still see that prejudice showing up. Property is not taxed at the same rate as, say, stock trades. But there are taxes that even the very poorest Americans pay besides military service. Because we're a consumer society, everybody buys things and everybody pays a sales tax.
Right, right.
So I want to kind of, I like the history stuff, and you and I can get on that too much, but we want to circle back to what Amelia's asking. How should we feel about this? Shouldn't we just give money to local churches and nonprofits?
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear you talk, Dr. Klein, about the scale. When we think about like the things that governments, municipal government, state government, federal government, the services that they provide for us, could the churches just pick up the slack and do all that?
Well, they attempted to. I mean, that's the thing. Late 19th century, there is a real serious effort to do just that. And as we become more and more developed, though, you are essentially creating systems in workplaces, systems in organizations like associations. It's like, we're not just going to let you put out a big wooden tooth outside and call yourself a dentist because it doesn't work well. And so you create these private associations. Well, churches increasingly were setting up private associations to deal with various what they deemed social obligations and social ills. But they were constantly passing the hat. And they felt like the whims of charity and the emotional appeal of a moment was not sustainable. You were constantly having to spend half your time fundraising instead of actually doing things. And so they began to try to find alternative means of regularizing systematic charity, is what it was called. And so systematic charity. Interesting enough, the Churches of Christ kind of divided to a certain extent on that issue, because
missionary societies,
and those other areas where you would give to this kind of holding group that would represent the movement as in its obligation to children or to orphans, right? Well, it didn't take long for people to decide that the better systematic approach was, especially when half your town is one denomination, to vote for representatives who would collect taxes and do this church work through systematic governments.
Church work meaning, in this case especially, care for the poor.
Right.
I think about that as I'm giving my donation at church, and when I pay my taxes, I do like to look and say, what am I doing here? The SNAP benefits recently. I think about people I know who are on food stamps who need the help. I think about the ways that we have, like, welfare is a good example, where this is just money we give to the poor, or Social Security, money we give to the elderly, Medicare, Medicaid, money we give to pay for health care for these folks. And I think, well, these are good things that churches should be doing. And then I look at like the federal budget and the amount of money that we spend on, let's just say Medicare and Medicaid, health care for the poor and the elderly. And I think, if you take all the church budgets in the whole country, you're not going to touch this. And we know that it's underfunded as it is. You talk to anybody who works in medicine, they go, man, it's hard to keep the lights on just on Medicaid payments, especially here in White County. So one of the questions that I always have about this is, I think we need more education. How much would we have to give to churches, and how many of us would have to give consistently to even begin approaching, there's an impracticality to it at this point, because we're also deassociating. I mean, we don't have those religious associations to the extent we once did. So if you're going to suggest that you can move in and take care of these social obligations that incidentally do seem to be really critical to the survival of a democratic republic. Right, not just a Christian duty, but like, hey, if we're going to have a healthy, functioning society.
If you don't have an educated population, this whole system breaks down.
Right.
You got to know what the civic systems are. If you don't, you are easily exploited by demagogues. You're easily exploited in every kind of way.
Yeah.
And the system historically breaks down. So who's going to bear that cost? Well, society. When we had robust church movements, they could bear part of that cost. And they could do so on a local level that was often more deft, more able to understand their local
more
community.
Efficient.
More efficient. Yeah. We looked for greater efficiencies through different systems. All systems have intrinsic weaknesses. And so if I was going to say anything to kind of wrap this up, the other thing I would say is the consistent pattern in all the historic debates is usually we want somebody else to pay.
Yeah.
Right. It's most of the fury is aimed at y'all need to do the right thing, not I need to do more.
Now that doesn't sound like a very Christian sentiment to me.
No, but that's
it is a human one.
But isn't it at the core of Christianity that we all need grace?
That's good. Yeah, that's right. I think about as we're finishing this, there's so much more to say on all these topics, but at least I have a little bit of a historical awareness and an awareness of the variety of what taxes look like. It's relevant to me that when they're mentioned in the New Testament, the consistent message is pay them. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. And then Paul will say, for this reason, you pay taxes in Romans 13. Give to everyone what is owed to them. And you don't see a biblical precedent to say this is theft by the government and so forth. And yet there's also a consistent call for justice. So I think operating within our individual spheres of influence, where we can say, if we're a elected official, we have to think about this in another way. How should we set policy? But when it's said, it seems to me that the Christian responsibility is something like this: to pay what is owed, to pray for those who are in authority, and to work for justice as best we can. And that means supplementing what we're doing with our taxes by giving generously to churches, nonprofits, et cetera. Does that seem right to you?
It does. And I'd finish up my thought by saying the other thing we always have to recognize as Christians is this is not our fundamental kingdom. Mm-hmm. We have a role here, we have an obligation here, but we're playing the long game. And so don't sweat too much of this.
Yeah, that's a great
It can't
word.
be the center.
Yeah. If we're obsessing about taxes, it's one more way of saying we're obsessing about money, the very thing that Jesus says. Don't worry about that. Don't take thought of that. Well, there's more to say, and we've actually got a bonus episode that we're going to drop with this one where we talk to a local public official, Matt Faulkner, who's our mayor, and I hope you'll check that one out as well. Dr. Klein, thank you for being with us today.
Been a pleasure, Mac.
See you guys next time.